Good evening, everybody, and welcome into the first ever installment of a new era here of a podcast on the GShow Productions YouTube channel. This episode will also be available on Spotify later on at some point tonight. But welcome to the first ever edition of the Jet Fuel Podcast. I'm your host, Graeme, the GShow Forsyth. Really happy to be here on this Wednesday night. The Jet Fuel Podcast is brought to you by Make Canada Fasteners and Tools. Be sure to visit their store locations in Brandon and in Winnipeg today. They are your one-stop shop for all your industrial needs. And they have a website as well, makecanadafasteners.shop, so be sure to check them out there. Also, we are sponsored by Terraco, an agricultural company here in Manitoba. They're locally owned independent retailer that have been serving Manitoban producers for over 80 years. With locations around Winnipeg, Terraco provides a wide range of granular and liquid fertilizers, seed and crop protection products, as well as quality mobile lubricants. Visit their website at terraco.ca today for more information. But yeah, in terms of what this podcast is going to be about, I'm super excited for what's in store from now until the end of the Winnipeg Jets season. It hasn't even started yet. Preseason hasn't even started yet, so we got a long road ahead. But I'm going to be bringing this podcast to you guys every Wednesday night, and I'm going to be joined by guests on this show to come on and break down past games the Jets had, talk about players' performances, as well as talking about news that impacts the Winnipeg Jets and news that fans want to hear. And we're also going to be previewing upcoming games. A special shout out to my music producer, Nico Feniak, for not only producing the lovely intro that you guys heard to start things off here, but as well as producing the outro of the Jet Fuel Podcast, which you guys will hear to end off tonight's episode. But yeah, let's get into who the guests are for tonight's episode. We're going to start with the first one, and that is Top Line Media's Nick Lynam. Nick joined me for episode 1 yesterday in a pre-recorded segment to talk about the Adam Lowry announcement of him being captain. We'll also go back and recap the offseason and some other great stuff that me and Nick are going to be talking about in tonight's episode. Coming up on the first ever installment of the Jet Fuel Podcast here on GShow Productions. By the way, if you are new here, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads of podcasts like this on the channel. But without further ado, let's get into it with Nick Lyman coming up now. And the first guest ever joining the first ever edition of the Jet Fuel Podcast, the official Jets podcast, Winnipeg Jets podcast of GShow Productions, is Nick Lynam. Nick is someone that is very active in the Jets community on Twitter, giving a lot of updates on what's really going on. He's not an insider or anything, just a fan of the team, and he also has his own project going in Top Line Media. So, Nick, I guess we'll start with that. What's it been like, through your process of running a media company like you have been?
Honestly, a lot of fun. So I had kind of spent COVID really planning it all out. We're kind of locked up. We're not doing much. So I kind of started listening to the podcast more. I wasn't really in the space as much. And then decided, hey, why not try and do our own thing? So rounded up some buddies that I knew were just as into it as I was. And a year in, we're still really enjoying it. Looking forward to getting back started in the next couple of weeks. We just dropped a Winnipeg episode, but the other teams we're following too. We're going to get back to our weekly schedule here shortly. So, it's been really fun. A year in, I've learned a lot. I'm going to continue learning a lot, but I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and it's always fun to start a project like that with your buddies, like you said, and awesome that you guys are still enjoying it a year in. You mentioned that there's other teams than just the Jets you talk about. Give us some more specifics on that.
Yeah, so we run weekly podcasts on the Jets, the Oilers, and the Canucks. We also do some league general stuff with the latest stories, some fun like quiz type episodes every couple of weeks. And this year there's going to be a fourth team. I don't think we've announced it yet, but we'll say it here. We're going to be doing the Toronto Maple Leafs as well this year. So yeah, we're kind of building on what we did last year and just looking to do some more. And yeah, normally we come out with our stuff every Monday. So
Well, right on and awesome. You gave all the viewers here the sneak peek of what's to come in terms of having that fourth team in the Toronto Maple Leafs. What's the growth been like throughout the first year of it?
honestly, it's been pretty interesting to watch how that works. It seemed like every couple months we saw like a big step forward. So we're really hoping to pick up where we've left off in that regard. It hasn't been something I've paid too much close attention to be completely honest. The one thing I really wanted to do in our first year was really get the process down, get used to this format, kind of worry about that stuff first and then worry about the growth next. So this year I'm going to be spending a lot more time on how do we take even more steps than we've taken, but it wasn't something I was too into year one. I didn't think it was too important as we kind of figured it out and grew as a group.
Right. Well, I'm going to be excited to see where it grows to. I'm sure a lot of people who, follow it and, could get invested in something like it have a lot of stuff to be excited about this season. We'll link Nick's company as information down below. Top Line Media will link their website as well as their socials. But let's get into what we're here to talk about now, Nick, in terms of the hockey side of things. Adam Lowry announced as the Jets' third captain in franchise history. Nick Ehlers chiming in. He's in full support of this new captaincy, and seems like a lot of Jets fans are happy about it. But some Jets fans have some mixed emotions on it. What are your thoughts on Lowry getting to see as the third captain in the franchise history?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. Obviously, it seems like it was kind of down to two guys. You had Josh Morrissey, who was the breakout North level defenseman last year that, we were hoping that we would find at some point. He kind of grew into that role, really led the team for most of last year, kind of faltered as the team faltered in that last quarter of the year, but it seemed like it was his team for that first stretch. And then the other guy who was eventually named, Adam Lowry, obviously had a big playoff run, big down the stretch after kind of adding a Nino Niederreiter to his line. He's kind of that heart and soul lunch bucket guy I think this market really embraces and really appreciates. So it's kind of interesting. It depends what you're kind of looking for in a captain. I know personally I was leaning towards Josh Morrissey myself, just because I think there is something to the idea of a captain being able to impact the score of a game, make a difference in a game at a bigger level than say Adam Lowry in a depth role. And that's not to say Adam Lowry doesn't bring value. I think anyone that's watched him knows what he does. He's a good shutdown center, does a lot of the little things and the harder things that not many people will. He's the first guy to step up for his teammates and all that. There's a lot of good in that package. I just wonder about the idea of having that star guy that can actually go out there and make an impact in any single shift, being the ultimate center. So we're going to see where this goes. I don't think there was a wrong pick out of the two, the more this broke down. Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see what Adam Lowry changes about the previous leadership group. He strikes me as a guy that's going to welcome in the youth voices, welcome in varying voices. And I think that was something they were trying to accomplish last year by stripping Blake Wheeler. I'm wondering now, with Blake Wheeler now out of the room, if we see Adam Lowry full-fledged bring that approach into the dressing room.
Yeah, and I agree with you on so many things, almost pretty much everything here. I think that it makes sense, and you were right about him being that lunch bucket, hard-working type of player. Lowry, one thing that has been consistent in his game is his work ethic and standing up for his teammates as well. And, he's become a fan favorite here in the Winnipeg for the Winnipeg fans of this Winnipeg Jets organization, and consistently he's shown up as one of the better playoff performers for the Jets throughout the past few years, which I think is kind of a problem in itself because, you want to see that, but you want to see your top guys elevating their level even more and not looking at Lowry as one of those guys as your top playoff performers year in and year out. But, it wasn't my choice personally. personally, but I'm not mad about it. I think, his teammates are in support of it. Ehlers,
Mm-hmm.
but I think, like you said about Morrissey, I think that he deserved to get it too. In my opinion, he was definitely in consideration for it. He had the career year last year, the true breakout at 76 points in 78 games played, and he also plays with an edge. A year before in 2021, 2022, this guy put up 150 hits. He's reached over 100 hits 3 seasons in his career, and he put up 89 last year. And I think that's more so because he was more relied upon to play a more offensive minded game. So that's why we might have seen those numbers decrease a bit. But he's been almost here as long as Lowry. Lowry had his rookie year in 14-15, Morrissey in 16-17. I don't think there was a wrong choice between the two. It makes sense that it was Lowry, but I do think that Morrissey would have been just as good of a pick for a captain.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there too. That I would have loved to preface my comments on is the fact that the leaders or the group itself, his teammates have reacted very positively. You had, I think it was 6 guys there for the announcement. You had Nick Ehlers chiming in from back home. He still hasn't made it over yet. Josh Morrissey was asked about it on the NHL Player Tour. He had some very nice things to say too. I believe it was Pierre LeBrun had that quote on Twitter. So I think that's important because that's the side that we don't see. And I think most often, just being in dressing rooms as I grew up, the team kind of decides that for themselves at points as well. Like there's things that we're just not going to see, not going to know. And I think seeing such an outpouring of strong reaction is a good sign for how the locker room felt about that decision.
Yeah, and it's huge in sports. It's maybe the most important thing in team sports, having a strong bond in that locker room and really committing to a leader. And hopefully the Jets do that and follow along in anything that Lowry does moving forward here as he becomes the Jets' third captain in their franchise history. Last being Blake Wheeler, of course. But speaking of Blake Wheeler, he got bought out this offseason, and the Jets, I've written a blog article on it. I'm not sure when it's coming out yet because our website still has to launch. But I'd say that, it wasn't like a fantastic offseason for the Jets, but one that I found pretty good, pretty successful. What are your thoughts on the Jets offseason?
Yeah, from what I expected coming in, I think it is still incomplete, but the movement they've made has been positive. So I think they did pretty damn well in that Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. Given that they wanted to retool, not rebuild, I was definitely in the camp of wanting to see a bit more of a rebuild looking down the line at maybe, let's say, 2025 and really grabbing those high-end younger assets. I think this core has kind of gotten to where it's going to go. But I do think they got good value out of that deal for their stated goals as an organization. Buying out Blake Wheeler was the best case scenario. It was going to cost multiple assets to get out of the $8.25 million in this salary cap structure. The buyout and just kind of eating that money was the better asset play. And it just feels incomplete because the questions around Connor Hellebuyck and Mark Scheifele are still over our head. And those decisions are going to impact not only this season, but the next 3, 4, 5 seasons for the Winnipeg Jets. So I like what they got done. Even bringing back Laurent Brossoit is the first time I think that Connor Hellebuyck going into a season has a goalie that the organization has felt could take some games away from him, which I think would be massive down the stretch, especially in the playoffs, if you can get Connor Hellebuyck down to 55 games. And then kind of adding in like some depth guys, like bringing Vlad Nemestikov back, someone that Bones trusts, seemed to find some chemistry with some of the guys in the lineup down that stretch. It feels incomplete because the futures of Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuyck just impact so much with where this organization is going. And we don't have clarity on any of that as we're talking here today. So good mark so far, but it does feel incomplete.
Yeah, and I think you're bang on with that. It is still incomplete because those guys being unrestricted free agents at the end of the season, the future very uncertain at this point. I think that a lot of Jets fans, would have liked to see some resolution in that. But Overall, I don't think it was like a mind-blowing off season. I think like
Hmm.
pretty good, solid off season for the Jets. You get deeper up front, you get more depth, and that's something that I thought was really lacking from that club. This club last season was the depth. I think adding, guys like Iafallo, adding Kupari as a guy who should be a pretty steady, reliable fourth line centerman on this team is good. And then of course adding a guy in Gabriel Velarde, who isn't as good of an offensive talent right now as Pierre-Luc Dubois, but has the potential to definitely be that. He'll have a chance to establish himself in a top six role here in Winnipeg. Probably going to be playing center, not too sure yet. That'll be a bit of a change for him, but he's shown he can play that position before. And definitely something the Jets fans want to see is that second line center position finally solidified, whether that's him or Perfetti or someone else. But I think the players they re-signed were, guys like Laurent Brossoit, definitely an upgrade on a guy like David Riddick, and he brings that Stanley
Hmm.
Cup pedigree now. He's been around a team that went through that journey and has won a Stanley Cup, even though he went through injury. I love bringing back Morgan Barron, who I think is going to be a key
Hmm.
depth piece on this team, and Nemesnikov, losing a guy like Gagne. I think Nemesnikov being younger can do all the things he does and better. And, losing Stenlin, a reliable centerman, Kupari can fill that role of that fourth line centerman with the solid face-off percentage. You add stability in net with Connor Hellebuck, like you said, behind him. Hopefully, his game's cut back a bit, but he's still going to see the majority of the net. I just feel that at this point, I think that the Jets forward core is looking better overall heading into this year. We know how
Hmm.
good Hellebuck is going to be as long as he stays here, but the D corps led by Morrissey, it still has its question marks. And I think as good as the system may be, there's going to be, some troubles there still unless they figure something out as things progress.
Yeah, no, on the decor, it's interesting because if you look at the breakdown of the Jets systematically last year, I believe they're in the top 10 for defensive zone via analytics, and that is a big credit to Rick Bowness kind of changing things over the course of the year. And then if you look at the forwards they lost in Dubois and Wheeler and kind of brought back in, I think they're going to be an even stronger defensive group up front. I think the big question for me is going to be who breaks into that number two center role. As much as I'm not a PLD fan, that is still a big hole that's going to need to be addressed there. And I'm curious to see if they're going to score enough goals. I think it's going to be a very different team in that regard. Probably a little more greasier, harder to play against, deeper for sure. I'm curious to see the shift from a highly skilled top six that bled chances the other way just as much as they were scoring, with a more defensive mindset, but maybe less pure talent. But on the D side of things, yeah, I feel like they're one top four D short of me getting too excited about that back end. Dylan DeMello and Josh Morrissey, we know as a pairing, they are very good together. Brendan Dillon had a very nice bounce back year last year. If he's your number four in that top four, I think you're in good shape. Dylan Sandberg had a breakout year in the second half of last year as well. I just don't see, unless Dylan, who is a UFA himself, potentially moves on at some point this year. I still think Sandberg will play behind the two vets under Rick Bowness this year, but they really lack that top four right-handed D, and the two options are taking up a lot of the cap at nearly $12 million between Neil Pionk and Nate Schmidt. And for me, that's the biggest question for this team is once they get to the playoffs, I think that's a very big hole that can be exposed that doesn't matter as much during the regular season. So I'm very curious to see if that is what gets addressed at the trade deadline in some type of way, because yeah, that is my biggest concern right now is that I'm not a Neil Pionk guy. I haven't liked the last 2 years of his time in Winnipeg, and they seem sold on the fact he's going to be a top four, and we saw what that looked like last year, and it wasn't pretty. So, what's your kind of thoughts on all that?
Yeah, and we'll get more into Pionk and Schmidt about their contract situations to end things off here on this segment. But yeah, I haven't been the biggest fan of Pionk's games since that big year he had. I think that there's a lot of times where he's a liability and a turnover merchant, as some people would say. But I think
Mhm.
that you're bang on with the forward group. I've said that I think it's better on paper, deeper this year, and I think that you were completely right when you said that they brought in players that fits more of the bonus system, playing more of that reliable defensive game. I could see the goals not being as high from the Jets this season as previous years, but I do think it's going to be a more balanced attack from this Winnipeg Jets team. But I do think that trade deadline is going to be maybe the biggest in Jets franchise history this year, one of the biggest at least in terms of solving problems. Are they going to move on from Hellebuck and Scheifele if they can't get deals done? Those guys will be high commodities, as well as a guy like Neil Pionk and Nate Schmidt, not only this year, maybe even next year, but do you look to move those guys and, let off some of that logjam that you got on the defensive side? It's going to be interesting to see for sure with 2 years left for both those guys on their deal with no move clauses as well.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. This deadline, I think the Jets are actually set up pretty well going into the season to go two different directions at the deadline. So obviously, if the season goes not the way they're planning, and they struggle as they're getting into February, not only are Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuck likely to be some nice pieces on the trade bait board, but Nino Niederreiter and Brendan Dillon are the type of guys that playoff teams are looking to grab, and they're both on expiring deals as well. So it would be fascinating to see what that kind of haul would look like if things were to go off the rails. And then on the other end, this is probably the deepest we've seen the farm system in some time.
Yeah.
It hasn't been great over the last few years, but if they did want to dip into it and take a shot at either at top four right-handed D or a 2C, should Perfetti or Velarde not be able to grab that and take it and run, they're going to have the pieces to kind of make that kind of move if they get off to the start of the season that they're talking themselves into here. So I do think they're set up well in that regard, where they're going to have options going into the year. It's just, I don't know. I guess we'll find out. I just find that I think they're stuck right in that middle ground, and it's gonna be hard to commit to either direction.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. It's kind of a waiting game at this point in terms of
Mm-hmm.
what we're going to see. And yeah, I did like Dylan's game quite a bit last year, the nice bounce back. But him being a UFA with them having so many left-handed shot defensemen, you're right. That could
Mm-hmm.
definitely be a guy that could move and could intrigue teams depending on what happens with Winnipeg's success during this year. Let's talk about Hellebuck and Scheifele. I'm sure you've heard the quotes of Kevin Cheveldayoff saying they're committed to win with these guys. And I heard on the 32 Thoughts podcast, Elliot Friedman and Jeff Merrick, that Friedman has heard that Hellebuck, once he gets to Winnipeg, he is open to, having conversations about his future here. And I've also heard that the Jets, you know, are thinking in a Scheifele return, per Elliot Friedman, that they'd want to get someone better, not better, but a player that is a roster player now to replace him at their center position. What are your thoughts on that and everything you've heard so far about 37 and 55?
Yeah, I'll touch on the Shifley thing first, because I have a lot of different things to say on the Hellebuck thing. On the Shifley thing, I think they've tied themselves to keeping the player this year with such an ask at 30 years old, heading into a UFA year. The NHL market has just dictated that teams aren't paying that much for rentals anymore. You're not going to get a Mark Scheifele replacement for a rental Mark Scheifele. It doesn't happen anymore. If you wanted to do that kind of thing, you likely would have had to make that move last year. So with them signaling that, I think that's their way of saying, hey, like, he's gonna be here. Just because I would be stunned to see a team give that up for one season of Mark Scheifele. It doesn't really make sense. I'd love to be proven wrong on that, because quite frankly, I think that'd be a great return if you could pull a top six guy that has a bit of term to put in. I just don't see it. So I'm kind of bracing for the idea that I think if we start the year with Connor Hellebuyck and Mark Scheifele on the roster, we're going to end the year with Connor Hellebuyck and Mark Scheifele on the roster, because I think this team will float around the playoff spot and it'll be too hard to move either. On the Hellebuyck thing, though, that is definitely interesting, because I've been kind of operating on the idea that he just wasn't going to come back. He was going to move down to the States and try and find a contender down there that he could try and win a cup for. He's made it no secret during his time in Winnipeg what his entire goal is, and that's to win a Stanley Cup. That guy is very driven in that regard. But with him being open-minded, he's kind of the one guy I'm willing to be irrational about in a little bit. I like to think that I'm asset management driven and, you got to do right by certain things. But I think Connor Hellebuyck's a little different in this regard, because I think there's so many added benefits to the organization long term, to the business long term, where he's someone I would bend for a little bit. And so let's say Ilya Sorokin got it, I think it was 7 years times 8.25 this year, which would cap kind of Connor Hellebuyck at this stage. Sorokin might be the best goalie in the league. Connor Hellebuyck's right there. Connor Hellebuyck's older. I would beat that deal in AAV by upwards of $1 million to keep Connor Hellebuyck here for the next 5 years. He's been this team's franchise cornerstone. You don't replace that level of goaltender very easily, and I think a lot of people forget what the Andre Pavlik times look like in Winnipeg. And I think there's something to it where this market where, Winnipeg isn't highly seen in the league. Winnipeg's still a young organization just coming back 12 years ago, where if they were to draft and develop a franchise goaltender and see him through his entire career, I think there's some prestige attached to that Connor Hellebuyck was willing to play his entire career there. I think that adds like a value add moving forward that, hey, this guy did it. He might be, if he gets the Stanley Cup, I think he's a Hall of Famer. Like he's been that level of goalie, and that's the only thing that's kind of holding him back right now. So I just think he brings so much value off the ice for the organization as much as he does on the ice, that he's the one guy, if you can get it done, I think you just have to.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he's Connor Hellebuyck. He's consistently been one of the top goalies in the game, arguably the top goalie in the game for a stretch in his career. Returned to Vezina caliber play this past season for Winnipeg. Yeah, he's 30 now, so is Scheifele. But for a guy like Connor Hellebuyck, like you said, franchise goaltenders like that don't really come around that often. And I'm excited for the guys the Jets have in the system. A guy like Thomas Milic, who they drafted this year, but are they going to be healthy? That's a tough task, tall task to ask for. But I think that, if Helly does want to resign here, whether it is for short term or for long term, I say you pull the trigger and you find ways to build around that in the next, few years coming up here. I think for the Mark Scheifele situation, I think you're right on that in terms of, it's unlikely, in my opinion, that the Jets are going to get someone back of his quality. I think it's going to be a bit less. This is a guy who, I've not been the biggest fan, as many Jets fans haven't been, of his defensive game, but he put up 42 goals last year. So I think that if these guys are on the team all season long, the Jets don't move them at deadline coming up this year, I think that the Jets are going to be a playoff team with the added depth and guys that they brought in this year, no matter how, suspect weak that decor is overall. But yeah, I'd love to see Helly stay in Winnipeg, and, who knows what's going to happen with the Scheifele situation. I think that's very much up in the air right now.
For sure. And on Mark Scheifele, I know he's a very polarizing guy in the market right now. He was once the golden boy, and he's now has most people ready to have him through the door. But earlier in this conversation, we're kind of asking ourselves, are they going to be able to score enough? And no one creates and drives more offense for the Winnipeg Jets over the last half a decade to a decade than Mark Scheifele. So it is a very complicated equation going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, you got Kyle Connor's still there. If Ehlers can
Mhm.
stay healthy, I think he can put up the goals too. But yeah, there's Gabe Velarde. But the real, consistent player throughout the past, back of a decade, like you said, has been Mark Scheifele and doing that driving offense and putting up the goals, coming off the 42 goals from last year. So yeah, a team that could be taking a more defensive approach could definitely benefit from having guys like Shifley staying on their roster this year to supply that solid offense. We are going to move into the final question here. The final topic is, what should Chevy's next move be? Like you said, they're kind of in the middle right now where they could go a few directions, but what would you like to see him do next to get this Jets team, uh, you know, going to that next level?
That's a fascinating question right now because it can go so many different directions. Um, yeah, what would I want the next move to be? Honestly, the next move for me, it all depends on Connor Hellebuyck. If he's willing to sign, that's got to be the move. If he's not willing to sign, though, I'm just not a believer that this team can go on deep enough of a run to justify losing him and Mark Scheifele for nothing after this year. So if you can't get Connor Hellebuyck locked up, I think you still got to commit to a bit of a retooled year, a bit younger, and get as much as possible for Hellebuyck and Scheifele. You just can't bring back that level of talent in the free agent market. We haven't seen Chevy really go out of his way to trade for that level of talent either. We've seen when guys have asked out, he's basically swapped them as best as he can, but we haven't seen him go big game hunting for a long term asset in that market either. He's typically held on to his prospects probably a little too long in most cases. So I just don't see how, if they're not signing, you replace them next year and continue to take those steps forward. And I just don't see, if they were going to make the Western Conference Finals, that's for me. Okay, I get it. I can live with the idea we lost those assets because you can turn $12 million in cap space into future assets, which we still haven't seen the Jets do. So I'm still not confident in them doing that. But I just don't see that deep of a run for this team. So I'd be erring on looking at next year.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point that I talked about in my off-season article, is that it seems like it's only when the Jets are backed into a corner where they make these big moves, like we saw with the Lyne situation and then the
Mm-hmm.
PLD situation. I thought
Evander Kane as well, even.
Andrew Kane too. The Jets, I think, made out well on this trade, like we've talked about
Mm-hmm.
with the LA Kings. But I think that, yeah, it all depends on what happens with Hellebuck, like you said. That's going to really determine the direction of this franchise. And say he signs, I think that the Jets, do they make any more moves? I think they kind of trust in Helly and what they already got again. But I think that objectively looking at it, the first thing that has to get fixed is figuring out that log jam on D, with Pionk and Schmidt
Mm-hmm.
both having 2 years left on their contract. We're overpaying for both right now, almost making $6 million, and they both have no move clauses, no trade clauses, that is. So they're going to be, tougher to move unless they're able to waive those. But you have young D that have proven their worth in the AHL, like Declan Chisholm and Billy Hanola. At what point do you make a decision to either keep them and choose to play them?
Yep.
It's not looking likely right now because of the logjam. Or when do you finally trade them? I think that I'd have to hope that signing Logan Stanley for what the Jets did, they go out and trade him for something. I think that size is something that's so valuable to so many GMs, owners in the NHL. So the Jets could get something for him. Maybe they see, a last ditch effort to get Stanley to be more than a depth pairing, a bottom pairing defenseman. But I think that for Connor Hellebuck, like you said, he's going to be the big decision, where this franchise goes. And I think one thing that could help the Jets in having them stay here is teams looking at the past few cup runs. Like they haven't won with superstar elite goaltending since Tampa won back-to-back with Vazzy. So does that decrease the trade market for a guy like Hellebuyck and forces him to, reconsider his options? Like it sounds like he hasn't signed here. That could bode well for the Jets, but maybe looking to add some more scoring to this team that's going to have a more defensive style of play up front, even though they do have more balance. I think all of those questions are ones I'm waiting to see if they're answered upcoming in this season and even next year.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to see where some of these questions go. I think the Smith thing really right now is really complicated. He did pop up in rumors. We had seen his name connected to the Travis Sanheim stuff around the draft. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had tweeted that I had heard, just networking around, that teams were basically asking the Jets for one of Rucker McGroarty or Connor Barlow. No, I messed that up, but Colby Barlow. There we go. And next year's first round or next year's first round pick just to get out of that contract, which obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the Winnipeg Jets to do right now. That's paying a lot of assets just to kind of give a prospect a look. The Neil Pionk thing is going to be interesting. Coming off back-to-back years with serious injuries, I think you nailed it with the turnover merchant comment. Just someone that's very sporadic in the D zone, and he's left a lot of good partners to dry. I just can't get myself excited that this is finally going to be the year. He's fully healthy. He thinks the game properly. He moves well enough. It's a tough situation right now. And I almost wonder, with how tight the cap is around the league, if we get to the deadline and for the Jets to make a big move on D, you have to see one of those teams that's selling take on one of those guys just to make the money work with where the league's at right now.
Yeah, and those are all going to be things to keep an eye on as the season approaches and as it goes along, up until and through trade deadline and until the end of the year. Should be an interesting 1 to 2 next years for the Winnipeg Jets. And Nick, I'm going to be glad to have you on here often on the podcast. Thanks for coming on and doing this.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes for you, buddy. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, man. I appreciate you coming on. It's Nick Lynam of Top Line Media and one of the biggest Jets fans I know. Jets realist, that is, on Twitter. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Thanks for joining me, man.
Yeah, no problem.
And Nick Lynam joining me on this edition of the pilot episode of the Jet Fuel Podcast, of course, brought to you by Mid Canada Fasteners and Tools. Be sure to check out their store locations in Brandon and Winnipeg today. It's your one-stop shop for all of your industrial needs. And also a shout out to our sponsor, like you guys have seen and already mentioned, Terraco. Be sure to check out their website. Terraco.ca is where you can find them. They've been serving Manitoba producers for over 80 years with the great products that they have. But yeah, Nick of Top Line Media, of course, we've linked their link tree down below where all of their socials are. You guys can find them on Twitter as well as on TikTok and some other places as well. Be sure to check out Nick's personal Twitter as well at Nick Lynam. But yeah, just touching on two last things in terms of what me and Nick talked about. I want to expand on it a bit more in terms of, what I said about Mark Scheifele, as well as I want to touch on Brendan Dillon once again before we bring on the next guest who I'll introduce in a moment. But for Mark Scheifele, I think that if the Jets hold on to him until the trade deadline and say they were to move him at the trade deadline, I feel like they could get a better deal back for him if they were to go out and go for picks as well as a prospect player. Not exactly a roster player, but if trade deadline comes and the Jets are looking to find someone of the quality of a Mark Scheifele, I just don't feel like playoff teams are going to give that up necessarily for him. As a playoff team, I feel like would probably add him. Who knows? Maybe it could be a team that is in that rebuild, retool stage, and the Jets get a better package back in terms of a roster player back for Mark Scheifele. But it's going to be an interesting development. We'll have to wait to see honesty, like I said, I think that if Scheifele is on this roster along with Hellebuck, the Jets are a playoff team, in my opinion, and that's something that you'll be hearing throughout this episode, us mentioning that, me and the guests thinking that they're a playoff team. But in terms of the log jam on D, I was talking about Neil Pionk and Nate Schmidt as guys that the Jets, should look to move to alleviate some cap spaces. I think they're both overpaid for what they bring, but in all honesty, I don't think the Jets get rid of Neil Pionk. He's a right-handed shot defenseman, which is something the Jets don't have much of outside of Pionk. There's Dylan DeMello. That's it in terms of the two right-handed shots on the roster on this current D-core that the Jets have, and seems like the Jets, like Nick said, are very content with having him as a top two pairing defenseman. Nick had brought up Brendan Dillon as a guy, and with his bounce back last season, a pretty nice one at that. He's big, he's physical, he is a left-handed shot D, and the Jets have quite a logjam on that left side in terms of, trying to get players in that are ready to go, the prospects. It's tough because of that logjam on the left side. And for Brendan Dillon, he's at $3.9 million. He's going to be easier to move than most Jets defensemen because he has no trade clause and no move clause on his contract, and that could be a player if the Jets were deciding to sell a few players that would entice teams that are looking to bolster their lineup, that are looking like playoff teams heading in to the playoffs. Brendan Dillon would bring a lot of appeal there. So leave your thoughts in the comments, what you think could potentially happen with Mark Scheifele and Brendan Dillon. I love to hear from you guys. And since this is a new podcast on the network, I'm wearing a shirt that I've had for a while but haven't had a chance to wear. I'm pulling it out. It's my Jets golf shirt, and super excited to wear it tonight. But getting into the next guest, coming up next is Evan Samoiloff, a good buddy of mine. He's going to be joining me in a pre-recorded segment that we did last night to talk about the Jets draft that they had. We'll go through the picks they made, as well as talking about some other stuff like the Jets preseason outlook, what to expect there come the play before the start of the season, and much more. You're watching the Jet Fuel Podcast here on YouTube. It'll be available later on Spotify on the GShow Productions page. Stick around for more coming up after this quick transition with me and Evan. It's a familiar face on GShow Productions. Well, he's been on here, I think it was only once back in January of this year, 2023. He joins a new era of the GShow Podcast here on the Jet Fuel Podcast, of course, the official Winnipeg Jets Podcast of GShow Productions. Evan, it's great to have you on here. Great to have you on the first episode, the intro of this podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks again for having me. I am glad to be part of the brand new GShow Productions. I think it's going to be great. I think what you're doing is going to be awesome. I think it's going to be fantastic for the Twitter scene and also just like the media scene when it comes with the Winnipeg Jets and all of hockey, of course.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. I think, the company has some big things planned, and great to have you on board. I had Nick Lynam on the show earlier, and we talked about a whole bunch of stuff. And me and you were going to talk about a whole bunch of other stuff in this part of the show in the pilot. But let's talk about the draft recap for the Jets. Of course, this happened back in June. It's long past now, but I think it's good to talk about it. The Jets ended up picking Colby Barlow as well as Zachary Naring, Jacob Julian, Thomas Milich, and Connor Levis in this past draft. I thought the Jets had a pretty solid draft, a pretty good draft at that. You could say that Jacob Julian, not the greatest pick in the fifth round, but a fifth round pick at that. Maybe the Jets see some potential there. But let's get your thoughts right off the bat in terms of how you felt the Jets fared back in June in this year's draft.
Yeah, so before I get into the Winnipeg Jets selection, I just want to talk about just how fun that draft was. Tons of surprises, tons of really good players falling in that draft. I was not expecting a lot of players to fall, especially with Matej Michkov, which I thought was absolutely insane. But speaking of players falling, I think the Jets got an absolute steal with Colby Barlow. Like, the first thing we got to talk about is that this guy was projected in a lot of projection rankings as a top 12 prospect in this draft. You even had some rankings that had him as high as a top 10 pick in this year's draft. So the fact that he fell all the way to 18th to the Winnipeg Jets is insane. And not only that, I feel like they got a player that they've been lacking a lot in the prospect pool. If you look over the last couple of years, especially when it came to first round picks, you had guys like Chaz Lucius, who is a speedy, skilled centerman. You drafted guys like Cole Perfetti, who may not be the fastest, but he's a highly skilled playmaking machine with insane hockey IQ. Guys like Brad Lambert, who is a big boomer bust player, all speed, all skill. The Jets have always had, a certain archetype of a player they like drafting. And that's why I thought with this pick, they were going to pick Oliver Moore, who was a player that I really wanted in that year's draft as well. But Kobe Barlow, I think, fits perfectly in this Jets prospect pool. Similar to Rucker McGroarty, he has that personality. He has the leadership. He has all the intangibles you want in a player that you see as a potential captain in the future. Speaking of captains, of course, with the Winnipeg Jets, they recently announced one. But this is a guy that has that character to be, that next group of forward, the next group of young players that this team is going to need if they want to continue to be successful. This is a guy that scored 46 goals, 46 in his draft year. Absolutely insane. This guy's just a pure goal scorer. The Jets have been lacking a goal scoring winger. Not to mention he's a big body, has a good shot. He plays aggressive. And from what I've heard and what I've seen on tape, there is a little bit of edge and a defensive side to his game that I also think is going to benefit with the style that Winnipeg Jets want to play hockey down the line. So in my opinion, Kobe Barlow was a home run pick. I think he will be in the lineup in the next 2 to 3 years because I just think that this guy has everything to become a very good NHLer.
Yeah, I agree. And Oliver Moore is a player they could have picked. Of course, Barlow falling to them, like you said, a projected top 12 pick in a lot of people's draft pools. And speaking of people who fall, he didn't fall too far, but Fantilli was touted to be the second overall pick. Leo Carlson gets picked over him. So even he fell to third. Of course, Matvei Mishkov could be potentially one of the biggest steals, if not the biggest steals in NHL draft history, if he ends up panning out based on his skill, second best player talent-wise in this past draft. But you're absolutely right with Kobe Barlow. He's a guy with a big-time shot, like you said, plays with an edge. He's hard on pucks. He has great compete. He's, not an amazing skater when you look at him, but he's got a lot of agility in his step. He's quick. And, he was captain of last year's Owen Sound attack. And, Jets get a guy who's been a leader, a guy who's going to compete, like you said, all the right intangibles and that big-time shot. Fifth in the OHL in goals with 46 and kind of underrated playmaker as well. Fourth on his team in assists with 33. And then, you look at how the Jets did for the rest of the draft. Third round, I thought the pick of Zachary Naring was nice, a guy that's played on, the best hockey school in the world right now in Shattuck St. Mary's, and they have been for some time on the 18U program, putting up 85 points in 54 games. In the previous season with the 16U program there, 87 points in 57 games. A guy who's a good playmaker, good deception with, the head fakes in there, good with his stick, not shy to get physical along the boards and gets to the right spots. Jacob Julian, mentioned him. Not a super exciting prospect, only 16 points in 40 games played with the London Knights last year, but I want to note that he ended up playing with the London Nationals last year and put up 41 points in 22 games played. So maybe some more development in the OHL, and he ends up putting up more point totals, and this could be a guy down the line that the Jets don't look at as a top-end player to put in their lineup, but maybe a depth piece at that. And I love the pick of Thomas Milic, fifth rounder. They got a world junior champion backstopping Canada to the gold and also posting back-to-back strong seasons in the WHL with his team in Seattle, won and backstopped them to a WHL championship last year with the .933 save percentage in the playoffs with a 16-3 record, 27-3-1 in the regular season with a .928 save percentage. And then the last pick, I thought there was good value there in Connor Levis, almost a point per game last year at 67 points in 68 games played with the Kamloops Blazers, and they get him in the 7th round. So the Jets, once again, not the most aggressive team when it comes to going out and making trades, but one thing they always usually do well in is drafting. And I think that's a credit to the scouting team the Jets have put together. And yeah, I thought it was a really good draft for Winnipeg, all things considered.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree, especially with Thomas Milic and Connor Levis as well. Connor Levis was a guy that I saw projected, later second round, around the third round. So the fact you got him in the last round of the draft, I think that screams value, especially for a guy that had a down year leading up to his draft. And then of course Thomas Milic, World Junior Hockey Champion. What else can you say? The Winnipeg Jets seem to have a knack of finding these late round gem goalies. You see it with Connor Hellebuck. You see the early development of Dante DiVincentis, I think it is pronounced. Like this is a guy where you just throw a dart and hope it hits. And I think they got one of the guys that could be that bullseye that the Jets need in net, especially with the uncertainties of Connor Hellebuck.
Preseason is going to be starting before we know it. Training camp starting next week. Me and you were having a bit of a conversation about that earlier on Snap, but we didn't talk about this in terms of, prospects that are in the pool that have, the best chance or a really good shot to make this year's Jets lineup, maybe crack the lineup for just a bit, in that short little span that they can play. I forget what it is, like 8-10 games before they can be sent down. I can't remember off the top of my
head. It's 9 games. Yeah, nine games.
Nine games. So, just if you think of anyone in this prospect pool, who do you think has a great shot to impress at this year's training camp and preseason to potentially crack this year's squad?
Just for clarity, I think a lot of the prospects that are in the pool are long shots to be making the Jets. So I won't be shocked to see none of these guys, crack the opening day lineup. But I think the one that does have the best shot, and it may not be the most popular choice, I think it's Chaz Lucius, who was the 18th overall pick in the 2021 NHL draft. This is a guy that's just battled with injuries. Like every single year he's been injured. His year in Boston, the University of Minnesota, my bad. He got hurt midway through that season. He was up to almost a point per game pace with 19 points in 24 games. And then he comes over to the Manitoba Moose. And unlike Brad Lambert, Lucius, he looked pretty comfortable in that environment. He put up 5 points in 12 games with 6 penalty minutes. But, this is a guy who was 19 years old coming into the Manitoba Moose and played pretty decent. But I think the thing about him that stands out the most was his time in the WHL with the Portland Winterhawks. Even though it was cut short and a very small sample size of only 6 games played, in those 6 games, he put up 15 points. That's nearly 3 points a game for a guy that only played for 6 games. And this is a guy that I think, if he's able to stay healthy, if he's able to, show to the coaching staff that there's a need for a centerman because this guy's a natural center. And with the uncertainty with the 2C, with a couple of players battling with Gabe Velarde, Cole Perfetti and Vlad Nemestikov, I think he could be the one that could shock in training camp, the one that can prove to the organization, like, hey, I'm an NHL ready player and I'm ready to take that next step into the lineup.
Yeah, and we think alike, man, because I'm with you. I think that this Jets roster is pretty much set. Maybe there's someone that surprises, and I think that guy could be Chaz Lucius. I think that he'd have a good shot to at least be considered if healthy, like you said. He's so reliable defensively. He's proven he can play against men in the AHL and hold his own, even though he didn't put up the most amount of points. But going up against guys, that are around his age in Portland, playing for the Winterhawks, putting up those 15 points in 6 games, proving he can dominate among that group of ages was definitely something that's very enticing and a positive outlook for what he can potentially do once he gets comfortable. But I do think the biggest thing is he needs to stay healthy. I think a player that is also going to look to impress, and I think he could. I don't think he cracks the lineup because there's such a logjam on D, is Solomonson. This is a guy that was a second round pick in the previous draft for the Jets. I don't see him playing just yet, considering the logjam, like I said. And, he was only drafted last year. The Jets usually wait to implement their prospects, it seems, playing the waiting game. But he's a smooth skating 200-foot defenseman, had a really good showing in prospects camp, going to play at the Young Stars Classic tournament coming up on the 15th here. So that's another opportunity for him to prove himself. And of course, a guy like Ville Heinola looking to prove himself as well and prove he can finally take that next step. These are three guys I'm looking at the most in terms of guys who could impress come preseason. Moving on to Ville Heinola. What do you think the future holds for him? This is a guy that was touted for so long to be the next elite offensive defenseman for the Jets, but he hasn't been able to get there yet due to many circumstances. The organization not really giving him that much of a chance, not consistently at least. What are your thoughts on Ville Heinola coming into this year and what his future may hold with Winnipeg?
Yeah, so the Ville Heinola saga in Winnipeg, it's definitely been probably the most widespread controversy within the fan base on, is Ville Heinola really an NHL caliber defenseman, or is he just the next Sami Niku, as a lot of people like to call him? I think when it comes to Heinola, I think there's only one of two things that you should do. You should either you play him in the NHL, you give him a really long run, not just a 5-game sample size, not an in and out type of situation like it has been. Give him a solid 20, 25 games, show what he can do in the NHL level. Or B, you just trade him. There's no purpose in wasting this asset. Ville Heinola would have been at his highest trade value a couple years ago when they traded for Brendan Dillon and Nate Schmidt. And obviously that hasn't worked out very well with the Winnipeg Jets. If anything, it actually might have hindered them because it stopped development for guys like Ville Heinola, Declan Chisholm, Johnny Kovacevic, who had just claimed off waivers. And you can even argue Dylan Sandberg. You could argue Dylan Sandberg was a year late coming into the lineup as well. So if you're the Winnipeg Jets, you really got to find out what you have in Heinola. And if you know what you already have and you're still not going to play him, you got to capitalize on that asset and get some value back before you diminish it even more. The only issue is that knowing how Winnipeg runs, he's still waiver exempt. And Chevy likes to hold on to assets as long as possible until the very last second. You saw that with Pierre-Luc Dubois. They waited the extra year to trade Pierre-Luc Dubois. You saw that with Patrick Lyne. They waited out as long as possible until they were forced to make a move. You could even say Evander Kane as well, when Evander Kane asked to be traded literally every single season he was here in Winnipeg. So you either give him a good run in the NHL this year, see what he does in 20 games, and if he doesn't feel like the fit for your organization, you either send him down or you trade him, or just trade him off to begin with if you are not going to give him an opportunity.
Yeah, and I'm in agreement there. If you're not going to play the man, trade the man, get what you can for him, get that value for a guy that's looked at, potentially to be an offensive type of elite defenseman in this league in that regard. Put up 33 points with the Moose last season, 48 games played. His analytical numbers have been strong year in and year out there. And he's proven he can quarterback a power play. He's good in transition. And I like his use of his stick work for a guy that, makes up for the lack of size with playing smart in that way. I think that he hasn't had a true chance to really show what he's been able to do in the NHL based on the sample size. I think people gotta remember that, prospects, when they come in, they're bound to make mistakes and they got to learn from it. And I feel like the Jets haven't really given him the shot in terms of giving him that slack, giving him that chance. Unlike a guy like Logan Stanley, who, that's a discussion for another day. But I think that if you're not set on putting Ville Heinola in the lineup at this point, he's proven that he can do so much and give so much value in the AHL. I just think it's not smart to continue to hinder him. And if you look to trade him, this could be one of the best times. And like you said, his value was maybe at the highest point 2 years ago. But I think that the Jets definitely should give him a shot, like you said. to really see what you got at the NHL level for a good sample size of around 20 games or so, and make a decision from there. So, I think we're in agreement on that once again.
Yeah, it's, I could totally understand the argument of he's not ready, he's too small. We need, tougher, grittier defensemen. We already have guys like Morrissey and Pionk and all that. But the issue is that Heinola has been performing at a top 5 demon in the AHL rate, literally the last 2 seasons on the Manitoba Moose. This is a guy that's averaging nearly a point per game on the blue line for a Manitoba Moose team that's been honestly pretty good over the last couple of years. And it's getting to a point now where, what else does the guy need to prove? What else does he need to do to get into that lineup? And looking at the logjam on defense with guys like Capobianco still under contract. You still have Logan Stanley, like you said, but I think he'll clear through waivers with his, $1 million cap hit. But that's for, another story. And then you also have guys like Declan Chisholm, who is no longer waiver exempt. Are you going to waive him like you did with Kovacevic and lose another asset for nothing? So it's a very tricky situation. It's a question that we've all been asking since the start of the offseason. And frankly, what I think they should do, I think they should play him. But I don't think there's room for him in this lineup, especially with how this team is in a win now mode. They're going to trust their vets. They're going to trust the players that they know. So I think it'll be another year of him either being in the minors, I guess in the American Hockey League on the Moose, or he's going to get, in and out of the lineup, press box here, in the game there, and it's just going to hinder his development and his value even more when it comes to around the market.
Yeah, man, you're reading my mind tonight, because I was going to say the exact same thing. The Jets being in a win now situation, win now mode, especially for this year. We'll see what next year brings. But yeah, I don't see Heinola playing over guys, of course, like Morrissey, who's the top defenseman on the team, most valuable to the Jets. But Brendan Dillon still with 1 year left. Who knows if he gets moved at the trade deadline or not? The Jets could get some picks back for him. We'll see what happens, but I think that Dylan Sandberg, already young D's, slotted in on that third pairing. He's a left-handed shot. There's such a logjam on the left-handed side, and it's not the easiest to take a left-handed defenseman and to play them on the right side, and that's what could potentially happen with Heinola if he got a shot, but I don't think so. I think that, like you said, there's just too many assets the Jets have on D. I think that Heinola has to have a really, really impressive training camp and preseason to crack this Jets roster. So we are going to take a break, Evan. We're going to cut to a transition. I'll be back with you right away. We'll talk about the Jets preseason outlook, what their focus should be, as well as going on year 2 of Rick Bowness. You're watching the Jet Fuel podcast, the official Winnipeg Jets podcast here on GShow Productions, or you may be listening to on Spotify whenever it comes out there. Stay tuned for more coming up after this transition with me and Ev. Welcome to the final segment here on this edition of the Jet Fuel podcast, the pilot episode of the official Winnipeg Jets podcast here on the GShow Productions YouTube channel. You may also be listening to it on Spotify as well. But Evan joining me, Samoiloff, that is, for the final segment of this first episode. We talked about prospects, the Jets draft. We went through that, talked about guys who we think could potentially crack the roster. We were pretty much in agreement on everything. We'll see about this moving forward here for these last 2 talking points we're going to talk about. Preseason is going to be upon us before we know for the Jets. I haven't even had a chance to look at the schedule yet, but preseason, it's not as much about the star players showing their worth, but it's about the players fighting for those roster spots, and also the rookies, the prospects as well. What do you think is going to be the big focus for the Jets during this year's preseason?
I think the biggest focus is going to be solidifying the second line center, whether that is Gabe Velarde, Cole Perfetti, or you run Nemestikov again, who looked really good in his little small sample size that he was a center for the Jets. I think that's going to be the most fun battle to see, because we've heard it all off season. They've hinted at it that they want to try Perfetti as a centerman, where, keep in mind, in juniors, that was his natural position. He was a center, but then in the American Hockey League, then when he came up to the NHL, they played him a lot on the wing. So I'll be excited to see how Perfetti, develops as a centerman if they take a look at that. Similar with Velarde as well, natural center, converted to wing in LA, and it'll be fun to watch and see who's going to win that battle and just what the line combinations are going to be, because with the new additions and with all the roster, with all the roster spots, there's going to be tons of battles, especially in that bottom six. I think it's going to be a fun preseason to watch, because very rarely, do you see, these battles happening in camp. But under Rick Bowness the last 2 seasons, it's hard to make out what exactly the roster is going to be on opening night.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a really good point you bring up about solidifying and trying to find the second line center for this team, because, without PLD, that's something that they're searching for at this point. You'd have to think that Velarde, ideally for this franchise, would be that guy. But Perfetti, like you said, a natural center in junior, has been playing wing so far in his career in the NHL. But, when he was drafted, Jets fans were looking at this guy to be a future top end centerman for this team. So who's going to establish themselves, him or Velarde? I think that one of the two, if they can, would be really fun to watch at that centerman position this year for the Winnipeg Jets. I also think, this is going to be about, we know who the locks are going to be on this team. Of course, Perfetti and Velarde are locks. It's just a matter of where they play. But I'm looking at guys like a Janssen Fialbi, right? If he can prove that he can be a serviceable depth player on this team, I think he doesn't make the roster. If anything, he'd be a call up throughout the season. But it's going to be about guys like that looking to prove their worth and prove that they can earn the spot. Or a spot on this Jets team. And then I think, like we've talked about already, it's about the prospects, like a Hanola, like a Lambert, a Lucius, Solomons, and, showing what they can do and putting Jets fans and this organization on notice. And I think it's going to be about, setting a tone and setting the pace for the season to come before it even starts, to get a quick start that could help benefit the Jets in a central division where, it's going to be interesting. We got Dallas looking like they could be the most complete team in that division on paper. The Avs are going to be very good again. Then we got, the Minnesotas of the world. Where does Winnipeg fall into that conversation? Is this a playoff team? I think with Helly and Scheifele, as long as they're here, they are. And do they make wild card, or do they go into that top 3 spot with both of these guys on a contract year where, players on contract years usually perform at some of their best paces of their careers. So I think there's so much intrigue heading into this upcoming preseason for the Jets, and I'm excited to see what happens.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think another storyline I'm interested in seeing is the Mark Scheifele, Connor Hellebuck saga here in Winnipeg. Both are, expiring unrestricted free agents. These have guys that have expressed frustration with the organization. But recently we've heard some good news about Connor Hellebuck with Elliot Friedman on 32 Thoughts. He mentioned how the door is not closed on a potential extension for Connor Hellebuck. And of course, with Mark Scheifele, he's been the talk about everything. There's rumors all the time about, is he going to get traded? Is he going to extend? I think this is, I think we'll figure out halfway through the year, if we feel like Scheifele is going to be a Winnipeg Jet for a little while longer, or if he's going to just be another UFA that walks at the end of the season. So that's going to be fun to watch leading up to the season. And like you said, and of course, the defense, I know it seems already kind of locked up, but I'm interested to see if a guy like Chisholm, who is not waivers exempt this year, can make a splash in training camp. And of course, like you said, Ville Heinola and Elias Salmonson.
Yeah, Chisholm is a guy that I think has really been solid at the AHL level. The stats have proved that, and a guy that I haven't mentioned yet, and you've brought up a few times now. That's a guy that is going to be looking to impress and put this Oregon notice that he can play in a team's 6 defenseman lineup. Throughout a season, potentially, if he does end up making it. But let's finish off with Rick Bowness here. He's heading into year 2. There was so much good that went into his first year as the Winnipeg Jets head coach. But, the trend in Dallas for him, he takes over a team that was coached by Jim Montgomery. Of course, he got relieved of his duties that year, but Bonus took over and guided them to the cup from the bench. And then after that, didn't have as much success as that, cup season in his last two. So, would you say the biggest question for Rick Bonus is how does, this team progress under him in year two?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I want to touch on Rick Bonus is what a breath of fresh air he was compared to the last 8 years we had with Paul Maurice. It's nice having a coach that just says it like it is. He's a guy that shows his passion every single time. He's not afraid to call out players. He's not afraid to, be real with the fans and the media about how the team is playing. And honestly, I think this might help the Winnipeg Jets a lot, especially moving on from the era of the Wheeler era. He was a captain for many years. He's going down as the best Jet in 2.0 history. But that locker room and just the culture in general just took a massive hit. And I think year two under Bonus, everybody knows, how he is as a coach. Every single player knows what to expect. Every player is going to know what they need to do to be in the lineup and how they're going to help the team. I think this year, with a better roster and I think with a deeper roster as well, I think they take, a bigger jump this year. I don't know if I'll say they're, going to be an elite team by any means, but I can see them battling, for like the third spot in the Central. But I definitely see this team making the playoffs as a wild card team.
Yeah, I agree, especially if Scheifele and Hellebuck are there. Me and Nick talked about it earlier in the show. Nick Lyne, talking about, and he mentioned it, how, this is going to be a team that might not be as offensively firing on all cylinders like last year when the Jets had a better top six, I guess, on paper. But I brought up the point how I think this is a more balanced Winnipeg Jets attack. And with Hellebuck there and Bro Swan now in net, I think the Jets goaltending tandem has improved immensely. But I think for Rick Bonus, looking at last year, he came in, improved the team system, how they play, the analytics improved in almost every single category. He allowed a guy like Josh Morrissey to truly break out offensively, and he put up the 76 points in the 78 games. But like you said, and you hit the nail on the head, holding players accountable and calling them out when necessary, that's something that we hadn't seen before. Rick Bonus, a more old school mindset in that aspect, which I think was a breath of fresh air, like you said, last season. And I think the question, like I already said, is how do you improve on last year? Do the Jets take another step, or do they fall back? I think that there's a good chance, like you said, that this Jets team is going to be in the thick of things for a wild card spot, as well as potentially battling for a top 3 spot in the division. And I think that, Lowry, the more I think about it, with him being named captain, I think that it's kind of a captain that Bonus likes, a guy who's going to work hard, that's going to take, not to say he didn't take the most accountability at the end of the season, but he's a guy that's going to take accountability on the ice, and he's a guy that's going to hold his teammates accountable. And I think that's what Rick Bonus does as a coach, and for that to be reflected on the new Jets captain, I think that could be a really good fit during Bonus's time here, at least.
Yeah, and speaking of Lowry and the accountability stuff, I don't think I think that locker room was just, the culture from Blake Wheeler was still, in that room during all of last season, regardless if the C was stripped or not. So I think, the comments he made, I don't think that's how Lowry is, because we've heard it before in the past, how he's accountable. He even said in the presser today, I heard it on Kenny and Reddy, the KNR show, that the end of season presser, all that kind of stuff. He took accountability on, going 42 games without a goal. He took accountability for not showing up when the team needed. But, I think Lowry is like a perfect choice when it comes to describing Winnipeg as a whole. Winnipeg likes to be known as a blue collar city. We work hard for what we do. We give it 110% no matter what. And I think, Bonus making Lowry the captain was the most ideal choice for what this, organization wants to become, what their identity wants to be. They want to be a hard team to play against. They want to be a team where the opponents hate coming into Winnipeg because they know it's going to be a tough game to play against. And I think it resonates well with the fan base. I think it resonates very well with just, hockey in general when it comes with the Winnipeg Jets. So, I'm very excited to see this new look Winnipeg Jets, and I'm excited to see what the new additions with Gabe Vilardi, Rasmus Kupari, and Alex Iafallo can do with the Winnipeg Jets, as I think those are some players that are going to help elevate the depth of this lineup.
Yeah, I agree. Thinking about more, like I said, kind of a perfect fit for captain under the coaching of Rick Bowness, who is very much about the team and holding players accountable. So it's going to be an exciting training camp preseason the next month or this month leading up to the season is going to be fun to follow, and can't wait to have you back on the podcast throughout the season, Evan, and maybe in the next few weeks to talk more about the team who is our favorite, the Winnipeg Jets here. Thank you for coming on and doing this, man. You take care, and we'll talk soon, I'm sure.
No problem, man. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
No problem, man. Evan Samoiloff joining the Jet Fuel podcast for the pilot episode. And my good buddy Evan Samoiloff joining me on this first ever edition of the Jet Fuel podcast, of course, brought to you by Mid Canada Fasteners and Tools, as well as Terraco. Be sure to check out Mid Canada Fasteners Tools, their Fasteners and Tools, their website at midcanadafasteners.shop, as well as Terraco's website at terraco.ca today. But that's about going to do it for this edition of the Jet Fuel podcast. We're going to take one final transition, and I'll be back for some final words on tonight's edition of the show. Stick around, everybody. Well, you've made it in to the last, not the last, but the final part of the GShow Productions installment of the Jet Fuel podcast, the pilot episode here on GShow Productions on our YouTube channel. If you guys enjoyed this episode tonight, there's more to come. We're going to be dropping these consistently almost every Wednesday from now until the end of the Winnipeg Jets season. I've been your host, Graeme, the GShow Forsyth. Special thanks to you for tuning in to this episode. It means a lot, and you guys are going to keep this one going. I don't expect this to start off big, as we're a small company at this point, but hoping to see this grow as things go along. Special thanks again to Top Line Media's Nick Lynam for coming on the show in the first segment of the guest slot in tonight's Jet Fuel podcast, as well as Evan Samoiloff, who recently just joined me, of course. And once again, a special shout out to our sponsors in Mid Canada Fasteners and Tools, your one-stop shop for all your industrial needs. Check out their website at midcanadafasteners.shop, and as well as to our other sponsor in Terraco for sponsoring this edition of the show. The Jet Fuel podcast will be coming out again next Wednesday, probably at 9 p.m. Central Time. Once again, be sure to follow us on our social media pages. They're in the description of this episode, where you guys can find us there and stay up to date when stuff like this will be coming out on the channel, as well as on our Spotify page too. If you guys prefer listening to the podcast, that's all right too. But special shout out to Nico Feniak once again, the music producer for this podcast. You guys are gonna hear the first ever it's going to be the first ever time where you hear his intro or his outro for this podcast, so that's going to be a lot of fun. He's a talented producer. He does a lot of great work, and he showcases his skills on TikTok. So be sure to follow him there. I'm getting notifications. It's just bad timing if you guys are hearing that dinging, but I apologize for that if it's blowing out your eardrums. I should, let you guys go now. It is getting late, and I'm sure to get some sleep very soon here, so thank you once again for tuning in. We'll see you guys next Wednesday. By the way, a new edition of another podcast is going to be coming out tomorrow, the first ever installment of the Pilot Mountain Hockey Academy podcast, dropping at 9 p.m. Central Time. So be sure to check it out on our YouTube page, and as well as the Winnipeg Blue Bombers podcast, the True Blue podcast, is coming out tomorrow or 2 nights from now on Friday night for episode 2 of that. We've already aired episode 1 that aired on Saturday. So that's enough of me rambling. Graeme the GShow Forsyth here from GShow Productions, giving you guys the salute, peacing out, and saying so long, Jets Nation. Have a good one. See you next Wednesday.